there's a certain level of, you can then sort of maybe like retort back and just be like, well, why didn't you tell me that when the recording was going, that you couldn't do with other participants.
Hello and welcome to the DePOT podcast. I'm your host Amanda Witt, and today we are speaking with Naomi Petropoulos, a DePOT affiliate and PhD candidate at Queen's University Belfast. Today we talk about family matters, or when our families stop being polite and start being research subjects. Her work on the history of the women-dominated garment industry of dairy has led her to interview both her grandmother and her mother-in-law, who worked in those factories. We discuss the experience of interviewing family, both from the perspective of being a researcher and a oral historian, and also as a granddaughter and a daughter-in-law. Without any further ado, here's my conversation with Naomi. So I guess I just want to start by asking you where you are in your academic journey, and if you want to talk a little bit about how you got here.
Yeah, well, I'm in my final funded year of my PhD at Queen's University Belfast, so it's starting to get really serious. Just at that kind of stage where I'm writing up and starting to sort of look at some of my findings. But really, actually, with COVID and the delays, I'm still having to sort of overlap and do a little bit of interviewing as well as trying to analyse what I already have. Really, doing a PhD was always kind of like an ambition of mine. And certainly when I actually did a master's in public history, and that's how I sort of connected with Professor Sean O'Connell, my main supervisor, who was very interested in oral history. So it wasn't something that I strategically had in mind, if I'll be honest. But at the same time, it was something that once I found out more about it and learned more about it during the masters, I was like, I have to do this. It would be absolutely fantastic. And looking at the shirt factories, I'm a Derry native. I'm from Derry in Northern Ireland. So the shirt factories were always a huge sort of part of the folklore of the town. It was always, things like, oh, that used to be that factory, or, Ben Sherman's shirts used to be made there and moved throughout the world. So I kind of grew up with those little sort of those little stories, basically. Especially because my grandmother worked in the shirt factories for most of her working life. So that's really how I came into that. Certainly with the deindustrialization side of things, it sounds really stupid, but initially when I approached the project, it never really dawned on me that it was like, this is a story of deindustrialization. But the more that I was reading and the more that I was conducting interviews as I went on, I was like, this is actually a story of a town that has experienced significant and drastic deindustrialization. So it was really something that developed over time, and now I'm really, really glad that I'm involved in DePOT and everything like that as well, because being involved in DePOT opens that world up a little bit more and makes me understand some of the things that I've heard better in the interviews as well.
Interesting. And so what were the first conversations like with your family members when you were talking about doing this research and maybe having them be involved?
I think with my grandmother, she was kind of like, "Oh, that's brilliant! It's a great idea," and you would get little stories here and there. But there was maybe, if I be honest, there was maybe a wee bit of a reluctance with her to talk about her experience, and even to acknowledge that she was part of this big thing. And I think that was more about her. It was it was her sort of idea that, oh, sure, my story wouldn't really be that important. In fact, when I said, well, I've really settled on, want to look at the shirt factories, she kind of said, oh, you'll hear some great stories from other people, which is insane. But that was her first instinct was, sure, my story's not going to be that interesting, so you may as well talk to other people because they'll be able to tell you more. So I found that really interesting. But overall, she was really positive about doing that, and I think with the gap in time, obviously I started my project 2 years ago, but the shirt factories really disappeared by the year 2000 in Derry. So there was quite a big gap between her leaving the shirt factories and then me doing this project. So maybe it was just she's in a different phase of life now, and that's maybe, led onto it too.
And was she there all the way up until the closure, or?
Yeah, the shirt factory that she worked in, she was literally there to the day that they were removing the machines around them. And that in itself was something that perhaps she didn't really want to talk about too much. Um, she kept sort of bringing it back to, well, we were finding work to do because they were still paying us, but we're not going to sit there and just do nothing, So they were like cleaning and helping the guys move the stuff out on the last day, which I thought was like insane. I've never been in that position where an industry is literally being wound down as you're sitting in the room. So yeah, that was a bit crazy, but uh, yeah, I think it was something that I don't think she realized exactly how big that was. Really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and it's also a commonality I'm seeing among people who are trying to interview women in general, but especially family members, of being like, well, maybe I'm not the best person to tell this story, or like there's so much reluctance towards asserting authority.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's that kind of I think it's maybe the personalities as well, that sort of I was dealing with regards to my family members. There was my grandmother who by nature is quite a shy person. She's quite sort of she's quite quiet, but when she talks, everybody listens. She's that kind of person. And equally, I interviewed my mother in law, who is also quite a shy person. Maybe not so much shy because, as we say here, she's not backwards about coming forwards. she'll tell you the truth. But I know she won't mind me saying that. But at the same time, she's not a kind of person that you would sit down and be talking for hours and hours and then go, oh wow, the time flew. She would be quite a quiet person. So that really played into it because I kind of had to work hard to draw their personality out, I think. Um, but also there was definitely some tropes that, like you spoke about, where it's this kind of idea that perhaps female history is something that people might not be interested in. Not my words, not my perception at all, but there is certainly a degree of that that I've experienced, not just with my family members that I interviewed, but also the other factory workers that I interviewed.
And it's also, I mean, I think if you just look at it in terms of investment, like what factories are being preserved, like that's something that's come up a lot. That, that's a really good way for, even when people want to look at your face as a, female, or, what they're assuming as a historian, and say, of course, we think that like women in factories are so important and they're so like, we do need to preserve this. And you're like, okay, but like the funding though,
Yeah,
please.
it's definitely a problem. Like I think I'm quite lucky where I grew up in a way, because Derry has always been a town of strong women.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I grew up, although my granny is quite shy and quite quiet, she is the very definition of a strong woman. So a fantastic role model, a fantastic kind of a worker, somebody who was proud to say that like she worked until she was 73 years of age. So and she loved it. um, so it's kind of, we've always had that strong sort of matriarchy um, in Derry, and it always makes me laugh as well because when I was first reading, it was this sort of this idea that the sort of statutory organizations, should I say, were kind of saying that Derry was this embryo matriarchy where the patriarchy was being challenged, and it was ever so grand, but really the reality is people were doing what they needed to do to get by. So I've always had that very strong sense of female empowerment
Mm-hmm.
growing up, which I'm very, very grateful for. but I'm sure it maybe takes people aback at times. um, when they're dealing with dairy women like myself.
Yeah. Have you seen any like misconceptions or situations arise from folks coming from outside the area to do research, or just kind of like in conversation being like, maybe you're misreading this?
Yeah, I think particularly humor. Any sort of researchers that I've seen coming into the city, a lot of the humor, especially like even my husband says this all the time, go talk to the boss, pointing towards me, and that's part of our humor. And we're not trying to say that we're fighting the patriarchy or anything like that, but it's that perception that, oh, dairy women are the bosses and that's the way it is. But it's maybe not so much a joke with a jibe, but there is a bit of truth in it because we are strong women. But certainly people who aren't used to that joking, they would be kind of like, as the male maybe emasculating themselves by saying that. I have seen that happen on two occasions with two different researchers that I had met who had come into the city. And then it was like, oh no, don't worry about it, because they were kind of like shocked and saying like, are the men folk downtrodden here or something. um, but it's very interesting. I think Derry in particular has a very, very strong identity as a city, and that does, kind of. I don't know if it could be largely an Irish thing, I suppose, maybe, but I'm sure there's plenty of examples all over the world as well, where the mothers are the center and of the family, and that kind of stuff. So it's always very interesting, and I think it was, that's why I really, really insisted and really, really pushed to interview my grandmother for this project, because she's kind of like, she's the head of the household kind of thing. She's the head of the family, certainly in my eyes. So I definitely wanted her story to be captured in my research.
Great. And when she has she read any of your work that you've made using those interviews, or has she had much of a reaction to it?
I think it was largely the interviews themselves. She was quite nervous. She kind of, it very much came across that she didn't want to let me down, which sounds absolutely ridiculous, um, on the face of things. And certainly, the fact that I pursued her as well, I was kind of like, You're worth listening to, as much as you don't think you are, you are. So she felt a little bit of pressure. And certainly when the microphones were on, I think then, she became very aware of that. And it very much came from that sort of like, I don't want to let you down. I want to tell you what you want to know. Um, so that sort of, all in all, I'd done three interviews with her. So the first interview was very, very nervous. It was very much me sort of allaying her fears and kind of saying, don't worry about the microphone. Even if you say something, even if you're swearing, don't worry. I can edit it. You'll be grand. Um, so that eventually she started getting a little bit more comfortable. But that being said, it was like, I've done my duty now. I've done my interviews with you. You work away and you talk to other people and you do your thing. Um, she hasn't, she would always obviously ask, how are you getting on with your project and all that kind of stuff. But when I offered her transcript and I offered her to listen back, she was all, oh, no, no, no way. Don't worry, nah. Uh, which I thought I think it was quite interesting as well. But equally, my mother-in-law just she didn't want to. And I think there was maybe a fear of hearing yourself back, because we always sound so different on a recording than we do in our own heads. So I think there's a wee bit of that as well.
Absolutely. I had no idea my voice was this squeaky. And then
Not at all.
I was just like, what?
Well, I'm very yeah. It's weird to hear myself back as well, because I'm like, I had no idea my voice was so throaty, and I'm like, I'm very sing songy as well, as you probably hear. So I'll be probably putting some people to sleep out there. Sorry.
All right. Yeah. And then so with your mother-in-law, kind of approaching her, I assume, was a little different. Because I mean, you're married, but it's not somebody you've known your entire life. Well, maybe it is. I don't know.
Yeah, it's one of them things. Like, I was 17 when I first met my husband and my mother-in-law, and I'm 34 now. I always have to work hard to remember that. So it's been a long time. But that being said, it's always, like the mother-in-law relationship is very, I think in general people tend to be quite sort of like careful and stuff. You don't want to rock the boat or anything, but so I do have to confess, my husband did a wee bit of groundwork and was like, "You worked in the factory, didn't you? You need to say to Naomi. You need to talk to her. You need to tell her what it was like." So there was a few wee sort of conversations like that, that he had on my behalf. But at the same time, anytime that I had seen her, I was like, I would love to hear from you, and hear your story. And what I found really interesting was she was very, very keen in getting her sister involved as well, because I didn't realize at the time, but I do now, that essentially all of the sisters, as well as my mother-in-law's mother, worked in the shirt factories at some stage of their life. And so it was, she wanted to have almost that backup of having like a group interview. But I didn't realize exactly how much of a group interview that was going to be, because at the time when we had arranged to do the interview, it was still that sort of lockdown. People were still being very careful. It wasn't the full lockdown. But I just said, look, it would probably be safer. We'll just have a Facebook Messenger call, video call. She has a wee portal, one of the things on her TV. So that was how we were keeping up with them during lockdown. And I initially thought that it would be her and her sister, her one sister, and it turned out that it was her and three sisters as soon as I went into the call. So it was like scrambling and sort of saying, because obviously the ethical paperwork and
Yeah.
all that kind of thing, I'd set the groundwork with her and one sister, and then everybody was there. And sorry, I keep hitting this microphone.
That's okay.
So it's kind of like, it was that initial shock where I was like, oh, there's so many people. How is this going to work? I'm going to have to rethink things. And, so that was very interesting. But I think maybe she maybe felt like, oh, this is a bit of backup for me. Um, so, that was very, very interesting. I was able to get follow-up conversations with her and just her. But that first one was, it was it was interesting, because then it became like a, contestant number one, what do you think of the shirt factories? Contestant number two. It was almost that kind of thing where I had to very, very carefully differentiate between, the questions, because although they worked in shirt factories, they largely worked in different shirt factories, so had different experiences. And she comes from a large family, so there was a big age gap between her eldest sister and herself. So there was that intergenerational, almost, in a way, element too. So that was very interesting. And it was also, then because it was the Facebook portal, then you started getting, sort of, like, I didn't realize that they had arranged that get together, at that time. But there was a couple of other family members. Obviously, Kevin's, my husband's father, was there, dropping in and out and waving during the recording, and it was chaotic, to say the very least. But um, at the same time, afterwards, it was one of those interviews where all I could do was just laugh. And certainly when I was doing up the transcript, I was laughing my head off, because it was, do you want a cup of tea? Somebody shouting from the kitchen, and my husband's father coming in and going, here's the biscuits, in the middle of an answer. So yeah, that was fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. It reminds me of during undergrad, I read this interview that was done with this, like, it was this project with people who had been working at the same job in New Orleans for, I think, 25 to 30 years. And they interviewed this woman who was bartending, and she was like, I'm sorry, I didn't have any time to meet with you when I wasn't bartending. And it's very clear that the whole interview, she's managing her bar. So she'll walk down, give somebody something, and then come back and continue the interview.
Wow.
Because it's a slow part of the day, it's daytime, and you're like, what?
But it's trying to negotiate those things as well, because you don't want to be cheeky or patronizing or whatever. It's like, but hello, I'm over here. Remember, we're doing an interview. I know those biscuits are really tasty looking, but come on, come back to me.
Yeah. And I think also at that point, you have to explain what, I don't know if this would be the case for you and your family, but I know for me, it'd be like just explaining what oral history is to start out. And then it's like,
Yeah,
wait, so you're doing like a newspaper article? And I'm like, no. Uh,
yeah, I think
so you're
that's
writing a
where.
book? I mean, like,
I think that's where I was kind of lucky in a way, because I had done so many conversations informally in the run up, especially with my mother in law, because it was things like that. Um, I had a quip from my father in law as well, which was quite funny, and going, "Are you studying to work in the hospital or what?" I was like, "No, not that kind of doctor. It's a different thing. Different." So yeah, I had those little sort of conversations that maybe I didn't really have to have with the other participants that weren't in my family. But yeah, I think it adds a certain element of the unknown that is terrifying but hilariously fun at the same time. I think. But I'm hoping I'm not like portraying my family and my in laws as well as like chaotic or something. But I think
oh
everybody's
no.
family is a bit like a bit like that.
Yeah. I was gonna say if yours are chaotic, like there's everybody's are. Yeah. That's the and then did you get any interviews through your grandma or your mother-in-law that you ended up using as well? Like people that they helped you get in contact with?
I think really it was mostly my mother in law and connecting the dots, with her sisters. Um, it sounds really silly, but initially when I was kind of setting it up, it was like, oh, I know that she worked in the shirt factories, so it would be good to talk to her. But I'd never even thought, even though she came from a big family, and it didn't occur to me. So having that connection and even seeing the dynamic between those sisters, I thought was a really sort of rich experience in between the passing of biscuits and cups of tea. Um, it was kind of really interesting just seeing, because there was it created conflict, but not in the sort of like dramatic sense of the word, but it was just kind of like, no, the shirt factories weren't like that at all. What are you talking about? Well, it was where I worked. There was that interplay, which I found very enlightening as well, because I think it's easy for me as a younger person hearing stories and hearing maybe generalized views of the shirt factories to then have in one interview these, four different women who had drastically different experiences while working in the same industry. And that for me was a bit of a light bulb moment, that I found really, really interesting, because it was like, right, I need to explore this a little bit more. And I need to sort of, get over that sort of naivety that it was just like, oh, they were all making shirts. So it was similar or the same, not so much the same, but it was similar experiences.
Yeah. And I would assume that would also inform the way you would then subsequently read any of the research that you're doing in order to kind of fill out that, fill out your work, right? Like, because then you're seeing, oh, there's like this plurality of viewpoints within just this group of sisters. how do I reconcile that with what I'm reading and like what I'm,
Yeah, I think
understanding in my research?
that's totally true. It certainly it led me to sort of look a little bit harder at the likes of the local newspapers, and sort of try and read between the lines a little bit. It's very interesting as well, the fact that a lot of the literature that I was sort of reading at that time, around that, was very much, um, it was very much a sort of, a generalization of a large geographic area. A lot of the literature I read, so it made me think, well, this is just one small city, in the north of Ireland, so there must be so much more to, textile industry in Scotland and Wales, England, even further afield. So it definitely made me a little bit more critical, I suppose, in my reading. But it also kind of connected a lot of dots where I was like, right, come on, you need to look at this, and you need to sort of explore it a little bit more than just um, the sort of maybe, what's the word, but like the generalizations. There was a lot of themes that were coming out of my interviews where they were sort of similar terms that were being used, just to describe all of the shirt factories, and what they meant to the local economy, what they meant socially. um, where I was kind of like, well, I need to look into this a little bit more, and maybe that's what I'm enjoying at the minute when I'm analyzing my interviews, where I'm kind of like saying, right, this person worked in this shirt factory, this person worked on the other side of town in a shirt factory. What's the little, kind of, what's the little differences? What's the things that are specific to them? So it definitely opened up
Yeah.
a thought process, I think.
Yeah, probably both. Did you see a lot of that with both location and time?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Especially time. A lot of the interviews that I conducted, and certainly the interviews between my mother-in-law and my grandmother, were so drastically different, because my grandmother had a longevity of service in the industry, for want of a better term, that my mother-in-law didn't have. Because my mother-in-law had a very, very large family, so there was a lot of sort of start stop, and then eventually she just quit the work altogether. Whereas, my my grandmother has a small family. Well, saying that, there's my mum and my uncle. So because of that, when she returned to the shirt factory, she stayed there for a longer period of time, seen more changes to the work conditions, seen more changes to the way that things were run with regards to international competition, and the fact that she was there when they were literally winding it down, that had that sort of bittersweet element that my mother-in-law's experience wouldn't have had, because it was her choice to leave at a specific period of time.
Hmm.
um so I find that very, very interesting, because I think, especially with family members, you sort of, it's easy to sort of just talk about the everyday stuff that's going on, but you don't necessarily sit down and go, what was it like for you growing up, or what was it like when you were working there. And it was really interesting sitting down with my grandmother and hearing about when my own mother was a baby, and what she did to get her looked after, and all those kinds of things. It was kind of like getting a window into my own lineage, I suppose, my own, yeah, just my own
Yeah,
heritage, I suppose, family heritage.
that's really cool. I think it's interesting how, yeah, there's this kind of overlap, right? Of how it's like affecting your research, having your family be part of it, but it's also maybe affecting, your relationship with your family in some way, that you're kind of opening, or like, I guess, crossing this barrier of the type of, and like the depth of questions that you're then asking, like, and wondering if that might make those conversations easier, or maybe a little different later on. Just asking them about different parts of their life, or asking other family members about their own like lives in this similar way?
It's been a really interesting process because both my grandmother and mother-in-law were drastically different in the way that it sort of, came about. My grandmother is probably maybe a wee bit more sort of willing now to talk about, things in the past and stuff, where, beforehand we didn't really talk about it. Whereas my mother-in-law kind of seen it very much as, I am doing this interview for this specific project about this specific aspect. So she's still taken aback, if people sort of ask her about, her younger days, or. Anything like that. So I find that very, very interesting. But there was maybe a certain level of frustration at times as well, in the sense of, um, certainly, when the mics were rolling and all that kind of stuff, and I was asking my questions and getting a wee conversation going, I often found out some really, really fantastic bits of information when there was not a recorder around. And it was like, oh, do you know, actually, it could be I was taking my grandmother to get some groceries, and we were, going down the road in the car, and she was like, this really, really interesting story. I was like, why didn't you tell me this when the recorder was going? And similarly, I had the same experience with my mother-in-law, where she said after the recording was done and I had put away all my stuff and everything, she was like, talking about some really important aspects of, what it was like, her decision making for leaving.
Mm-hmm.
What, that when I asked her about it when the recording was going, she didn't tell me. So there's a certain level of, you can then sort of maybe like retort back and just be like, well, why didn't you tell me that when the recording was going, that you couldn't do with, other participants. But then equally, if I said, oh, go and let me get my recording stuff out, they'd be all, no, I'm away to do this, or so there's that family dynamic as well that is frustrating at times. Especially when you're in this mindset of collect evidence and collect stories, and yeah, I want my recordings because they're precious, and that's my evidence. So yeah, it's fun and frustrating, I think.
Yeah. Um, and then, yeah, I was also wondering, I feel like there's been a couple of things that you've brought up already, but if there's another specific thing you want to share that either your family members told you that surprised you, either during recording or like you're saying, in the, oh, that reminds me moments.
I think it's more their attitude towards work in general that really surprised me. Um, like I sort of, as I said before, that a lot of Derry isn't a particularly sort of affluent city, and that's a huge generalization, but it's certainly a city that hasn't really experienced the likes of, like gentrification on the scale that its bigger neighbour Belfast on the other end of Northern Ireland has experienced, or so it's still a very sort of socially deprived area and place. So we definitely have an attitude of, do what you need to do to get by. Make sure that you're working, providing for your family. That's very, very strongly ingrained into both mine and my husband's family members. That's just our kind of general attitude. So when you heard, I always assumed that my grandmother being at work for as long as she did, there was an assumption on my behalf that it was almost this girl power kind of thing, which is maybe naive, maybe just I listened to too much Spice Girls when I was growing up. I don't know. I think it was certainly my own perception was that, where it was kind of like, you know you do what you do, you go out, you work. There's a pride of work. Not saying that she didn't have a pride in work at all. She definitely did, but she never viewed it that way, as being this very, I'm an empowered woman because I'm out working. It was very much seen as, this is what I needed to do for my family. This is my circumstances. There wasn't this sort of big feminist narrative that I think that I had in my head. But then that could come from the fact as well that my grandfather actually had to retire early on medical grounds. He was a factory worker as well, not in the shirt factories, but in the sort of the bigger manufacturing ones. So growing up, my granny was always the one that was out working, and my grandfather was the one who was very much, he was an absolute fabulous cook, unbelievable. I learned so much from him. Just a fantastic guy. But he was always very like, right, well, I'm not working, your granny's out working, so I'll do the housework. I'll do, all these traditional notions were kind of like, they never existed in our family. And I think perhaps it could be largely because the fact that I had a very, very strong male role model who was a housekeeper, he was a cook, he was all these things that the traditional societal notion was kind of flipped on its head. So that's probably where I got this perception of, this is, the real feminist, and my granny, that's why she was out working and stuff like that. But really the reality was, she was out for the good of her family in general. And she was a great she went to sort of great lengths during the interviews to sort of reiterate that. Um Certainly when, if I was asking questions that would be more sort of like feminist leaning, things like, was it a great sense of pride when you were working in a female dominated industry? That must have been something. And she was kind of just saying, well, actually, I was out, I was working, I was doing what I had to do for my family, and that blew me away. I was really surprised at that. So it certainly gave me a different perception, and it certainly made me sit up and realize that you can't sort of project your assumptions based on your current values and your current time, on certainly, the longevity that my grandmother was working. She's seen different iterations of societal norms when it comes to female workers and things like that. So it was something that I really had to keep in mind, and it was kind of like, a lot of those moments you sit in reflection and go, that is so obvious, how didn't you realize that? But it's all part of the journey. And it's all part of that kind of sort of, you know it's the beauty of oral history, really. It's the beauty of finding out people's opinions, their viewpoints, and are they very like your own, are they different? Um so that was a very interesting thing. Another thing that kind of I found quite interesting, that perhaps wasn't as sort of revelational, if that's even a word, as the sort of work side of things, was trying to flip the switch between being granddaughter and sort of, daughter-in-law, to oral historian stroke researcher stroke student stroke all those different things that a PhD candidate is. Trying to flip back and forth created a dynamic, and in hindsight, I think to myself, I could have been a little bit more natural about that. But I don't, it was something that I found a little bit difficult, was especially, when it comes to the first interview, where you're making sure that the ethical paperwork is in place. You're telling them what you're doing with the transcripts and the interviews, and you have to tell them this information. It's ethically and morally imperative that you tell them this. But it makes you then transform from a family member into this researcher who is also a family member. So it's a wee bit of a
Mm-hmm.
muddied kind of situation. And I think I found that more awkward than they did in hindsight. So it was kind of, they were like, yeah, you got to do what you got to do, just get it over and done with, that's grand. Whereas I was going, oh, I'll need to make sure that I'm putting on my, my official hat here and telling them what's going on and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So that to me is something, in hindsight, and if I could do it again, I think it would be a wee bit more natural and less like, a sort of person with a clipboard going, here's the checklist, I must go through this in this order, you know.
Yeah. I can imagine doing that with my own family members would lead to a lot of teasing. Like,
Yeah, I was lucky.
just
I
like,
didn't get a lot of teasing, but I got a lot of weird looks and raised eyebrows at
like, is
times.
everything okay now? Yeah. And it's also another thing as we're talking about that separation between the researcher and the family member is like, how does it feel as a granddaughter and as a daughter-in-law to create this work with your family and then know that it is now part of research? Like, these interviews could, if these kinds of permissions are on them, go into an archive. They can be something that somebody else studies. Like, how does that feel, like not necessarily as a researcher but as a family member?
It feels absolutely amazing. And here's the geek is going to come out in me now, but knowing that something that I sort of helped put together and there's going to be that longevity there, I'm always going to have those interviews. I'm always going to have that moment in time where there's that connection. And it was like, because I think everybody, especially when you're studying in some capacity, you become so focused on your work, and it becomes such an all encompassing kind of thing, where you're kind of saying, you know, yes, I'm doing work, which is obviously hugely important, pays the bills and all that kind of stuff, but I'm having this intersection with my family at the same time. So it's both sides of your life are coming together, which I think is so cool. um, Luckily, I do have the permission to use their interviews in a bigger archive with the local museum here in the city as well, because I've been relentlessly nagging them to have a bigger archive and a bigger presence, for the shirt factories, because it's something that hasn't really manifested until recently. So knowing that other people are going to hear those interviews, and it could be 20, 30 years down the line, and my grandmother's voice, my mother-in-law's voice, and her sisters are going to be used for something bigger. I think that's so cool. Really,
Yeah,
really cool.
it's so
um
special.
it is so special, and it's something that, if you really think about it, you start getting a bit emotional about it, in a way, because it's kind of like, well, that's why we do what we do as oral historians. We want to give that voice, and to have a recording that provides a longevity to somebody who is so close to you. I think that's like, it's just super cool. There's no posh fancy
Yeah,
term for it. It's amazing. It's class.
that's wonderful. Yeah, so I don't have any more questions for you, but if there's anything I didn't ask you about or any other details about your research that you want to talk about, I would love to. We have as much time as you would like.
I think really it's we've kind of covered, like, especially with the family and stuff like that. It's sort of one of those things that only now, sitting having this conversation and reflecting on it, you start kind of thinking about, these little different things, and um different ways to approach it and stuff. And yeah, I think it's quite cool, sort of having the opportunity to sit down and have a conversation like this. And certainly because everybody's experience is so different, um that, I'm hoping, and also having this conversation where it's kind of like, some people maybe experienced the chaos that I described, themselves, and feel maybe bad about it. But like, yeah, I think it's quite cool, sort of knowing that there's other people out there working with family members that maybe maybe they might listen to this and go, that's okay, because I felt the same way as well.
Oh, I do have a question, which is, do you have any advice for someone who's just about to approach a family member for oral history interviews?
Oh, I'd be very tempted to just say, don't do it the way I did. But I think everybody says that about their own work. Everybody's hypercritical of their own stuff. I think really, uh, the main advice, and if I was to talk to myself a couple of years ago, do a lot of groundwork. And I think that depending on the personality of the family member, and depending on your relationship, um, reassure and make sure to let them know that really this is not the sort of be all and end all, because I kind of at times I kind of felt that my grandmother in particular felt a good bit of pressure to impress. So if I had have done a little bit more groundwork where it's like this is a conversation, and sort of ingrained that a little bit better, I think it would have been a more comfortable time for her, and in turn a more comfortable time for me, because as oral historians we always are quite reflexive, in the way that we approach things. We see what the participant, the oral history participant, is experiencing on their face or whatever, and we adjust accordingly. So my head was working overtime, and I'm sure hers was as well. So that would definitely be my advice. Do a good bit of sort of lead in time to it, and sort of feel out the process a little bit. Don't feel that you have to be as rigid in your interview style, even if it's just a case of putting on the recorder in the corner of the room, and obviously telling them that it's there and it's recording and stuff, but just having a general conversation. Perhaps that would have benefited me as well. But yeah, I think it's, especially with family members, be prepared for the chaos, be prepared for the kind of the fact that you have to switch your relationship up a little bit, and be prepared to kind of be like, give yourself that time and that downtime afterwards to process it and go, wow, this is really cool. And analyze it sort of properly. I think really that would, yeah, try and be less structured and less rigid. That would kind of be mainly where I would
Yeah.
be coming from.
Cool. Okay. Well, I feel like we are at a pretty good time to wrap it up. Is there anything that you're working on right now that you want to talk about? I mean, it seems like you're just finishing up the PhD, so probably not much time.
Yeah, I think everything is just, especially in the final year, everything needed to be done 6 months ago. It's that feeling at the minute, but something that I was really, really privileged to do was to be involved in a sort of temporary exhibition with the Tower Museum, which is the local museum here in Derry, the council run museum, and I was able to put together a little app, a web app as well, of little snippets of some of the interviews that I conducted on different themes and things. So it's just at originaldairygirls.com, to say that right. So if anybody wants to kind of check out some of the aspects that have come up in the research, feel free. But that was a real cool thing as well, because my mother-in-law and her sisters are on there. My grandmother is on there as well. So that in itself, I think, is quite cool. Sort of, I've been able to do things aside from my PhD, and actually related to my PhD as well. So that's been pretty cool.
That's very exciting. And I'll definitely put the link to originaldairygirls.com in the little bio for the podcast. That'll be great.
Yeah, that's cool. Thank you.
Yes. This has been the DePOT podcast. If you would like to hear more about deindustrialization and the politics of our time, our affiliates and our projects, please find us at deindustrialization.org, or follow the podcast on Twitter at deindustrialpol, so the word deindustrial and the letters POL at the end, where you can ask questions or pitch an episode. If you have enjoyed the program, please consider rating us or writing us a review. It really does help the show gain visibility in the vast kingdom of history-focused podcasting. Thanks again to Naomi for taking time to speak with me today, and thank you for listening. Have a lovely day. Oh gosh, well, I really hope that we all get to see each other in person someday.
It might happen.
Be honest.
I'm saying nothing now. I've had to cancel too many plans, so
Yeah.
saying nothing.
Okay.